Now pay attention. Everybody listen carefully. For some reason, Eventbrite, the people who do the ticketing that we use, have started picking on random people. I don't know why, but you get a message from them saying further information needed. Now, if you don't notice that and you don't click on it and give them the information they need, you haven't bought a ticket, even though you think you have. So for the last 3 or 4 meetings, there's always been people on our list where it just says that somebody inquired about a ticket but didn't buy it, and we don't know who they are, so we can't contact them. And I think that's what probably happened with Vic and David, because you then you're not on the email list, so therefore you don't get the link. So when you click on the Eventbrite system, if it says you need further information, then do as you're told. Otherwise you'll never get in. It's worse this time because Martin's not here, so people have been emailing Martin. He asked for the day off. He's the only one, I think, apart from Derek.
If you can hear this, unmute me.
Derek
I found that the link.
Sorry, Conrad. Conrad, did you say something?
I found that the link was on 2 lines in the email. Yes, the email had 2 lines for the link.
Right.
And often that will make it not go through.
If you've got the email, then you've got the link, as it were. But it's the
the link is there, but it was on 2 lines with a carriage return in the middle.
2 lines.
Okay.
Anyway,
a carriage return in the middle.
Okay, thank you, Conrad.
You have to copy it out and paste it as one line.
The point is, Martin's not here today, so Derek stepped in. Thank you, Derek. And I think Derek and Martin are the only people who have been to every one of these meetings, because I've missed a couple. You there, Derek? You saying something?
Yes, I was just going to say that David Atkinson hasn't appeared yet, but he's just appeared, and I've let him in.
Yeah, I've just emailed him. So he's missed the thing about why he didn't appear. That's the trouble. Once you don't appear, then you don't know why you're not there. Anyway, hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of Steve's session on same song, different song, or the other way around. But before we do that, I'll tell you that our next meeting is the 16th of June. And that'll be back to our normal pattern of 3 papers. I can't remember who they are for the moment. I'll remember it by the end of the meeting. So 16th of June is our normal session, but then we get the whole of the summer off, and we're back on the 8th of September. Will be the start of the autumn season, and we're open for volunteers for that one. But before that, we have our big conference, 2-day conference in London called Collectomania, about the collectors and collecting and stuff. July the 20th and 21st. The tickets are now available on the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website. So that's bwml.org. We'll get you there, and we hope to see you all there, because we think it's going to be quite a good thing. It'll be nice.
Okay, that's a start.
Sorry, somebody say something.
Ow.
Okay, carry on. I've muted.
Carry on. I think that's all the parish notices. So we're going to go over to Steve. Are you there, Steve?
Yep. Okay.
After you.
Right. Okay then. Steve, I'd like you to come. We had a little discussion before we started, and you were mentioning sort of the rationale and things like that, and why, we're coming back to things and the having to decide whether the numbers need changing or split more numbers or stuff like that. If you, at some point, perhaps after I've gone through the laws stuff, if you want to come back in and sort of like explain how some of these things have happened, I think that might be useful. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yes. Fine.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I've been corresponding with one or two important people who have an interest in this. But before I go into that as well, just to make sure that people, perhaps some of you weren't actually present at the initial meeting that we had, a discussion that we had over, and there I used problems with some of the child ballads. There weren't that many of them anyway, and I don't propose to go over that again, although, you know, that is still something that ought to be up for discussion at some point. I'm moving on to the laws situation, but before that, as I say, I've had a conversation, email exchange with one or two people. One of them was Ben Schwartz, who hopefully is there listening somewhere, and we were discussing a specific song that occurs, or in fact two songs that occur in the Roud Index that were really actually two separate songs with links. They've always got some sort of links or something in common, but eventually with a detailed study, and it's a good example of what can happen and how the Roud numbers might need some sort of alteration. And it was the one, the Riley songs. It was the George Riley, John Riley ballads. Two of those, and it ended up when we'd looked at all the versions, when Ben in particular had looked at all of the versions and come up with the idea that I'd also come up with independently, that they ought to be two separate ballads with a few bits and pieces in common. So that was one that cropped up. Another one, very important person here, Bob Waltz, who we're discussing these problems because Bob is very much concerned with the traditional ballad index, of course, and using Roud numbers quite frequently. And I won't read out all of our correspondence, but initially we were discussing things like the Streets of Laredo and the Unfortunate Rake and all of those related ballads, and how that Bob tends to use lots of separate titles because there are lots of different, what I would call eco types. I'll come back to that name in a minute. And I think that the thrust of Bob's email was that perhaps certain ones amongst them at least ought to have separate numbers because they have obviously purposely been rewritten at some point. He also mentioned that there are quite a large number, not a massive number, but a large, significant enough number of Roud numbers that he uses that he's felt the need to separate out in some way, sometimes twice, sometimes three times, and so on. And one in particular that he mentioned at the end of that email was the Wassail songs. There are, if you look at all the Wassail songs in England and elsewhere, perhaps, we see that there are some significant differences and that there are some that are definitely different to others and have a totally different text, etc. And they need looking at in detail as well. Okay, and then once I'd done that initial email, I suggested that I tend to use the word eco types for where a song has been rewritten, but it's obviously closely related to a previous song. He says, I guess you could use the word eco types. With my background, the word I would use is recensions. A recension being a deliberate rewrite of major proportions. To take an example that a folklorist might know, Ilias Limnot's Old Kalevala. These are things that I don't know much about. I won't go into much detail there. They're recognizably akin, but there was a deliberate intervention along the way. And I think this idea of a deliberate intervention along the way is quite important to the thing that we're studying here. Similarly, with the Streets of Laredo, the young man cut down in his prime, clearly reworkings of the Unfortunate Rake. Somewhere along the line, someone reworked the song. Furthermore, people who sing Streets of Laredo generally don't think of it as a cowboy version of the Unfortunate Rake, but as a song in its own right. So in this case, it's the act of rewriting that defines the split. And of course, by split, we're looking at here perhaps separate Roud numbers. Similarly, King Orfeo, Sir Orfeo are clearly versions of the Orpheus legend, but they are clearly not the same piece as, say, Ovid's story of Orpheus. Same legend, a lot of the same Thompson motifs, but different telling. And that's the important thing, I think, here. Different text, different telling. Also, in the case of something like the Who Will Shoe My Pretty Little Foot, we're talking here that Bob tends to get quite a lot of fragmentary pieces or pieces with what we would call floating verses, sometimes just the floating verses themselves. And what defines a split is whatever is left over if you take out those verses, those commonplaces. There are cases where I combine two songs that have the same round number, but I don't have as good a way of finding those. My best guess is that I have 173 of those compared to 600 plus, where I split a round number, so I'm somewhat more of a splitter than Steve is. And I can empathize with that because what Bob said there, because myself, I generally tend on the side of splitting things up, and we can discuss that in more detail as we go along. So to come back to I'd say last time we dealt with the child ballads and looked at those where there are some that people have said these two are the same song, and then Child had said they were two separate songs, and vice versa as well. But I'd like to now move on to the laws ballads and what laws. The difficulty. This is a separate issue, but one of the things that laws did that has a different set of problems to it, but it's something that might be of interest to some people, obviously, is that laws split up into different types of songs. He classified the ballads into different themes, and this can be even more consuming than what we're talking about here, because there are lots of ballads that would split into several, that would go under several themes. But that's not the issue we're looking at here. We're looking at how laws, which the system he chose, the lettering system, the letter for the classification of a type of ballad, and then the arbitrary number that he gave it, and then going on from that, he added onto any that he thought, well, these two are related, but they perhaps need separating out, and he used a second letter on certain ones. So we're looking, first of all, this only happened 6 times in Lawes's from the British broadside ballads. I don't have the Native American ballads laws, and I haven't looked at that, but I'm sure there are similarities in there as well that people might like to discuss at some point. But so we're looking at the British ballads from the American ballads from British broadsides, yeah, and we're looking at K22 initially, and there you've got Captain Glenn and the New York Trader. Now we have here, it is obviously the New York Trader is a rewrite. It has 9 of the 14, well, Captain Glenn, which it came from, has 22 stanzas from circa about 1770. And the New York Trader is about an 1830s rewrite, American rewrite of the 14 stanzas. 14 of the 9 of the 14 come directly from Captain Glenn. So I think there is a case to be made, and what we're talking about here is neither myself nor perhaps even Steve, or perhaps anyone else can say, yes, this ought to be 2 separate numbers, or this is the same song. What we're doing here is we're trying to come up with some sort of rules. We might have different opinions on this, but to try to those people who are doing the classifying, we're trying to make the system more workable. That is what we're doing. And so all I can do here is present where there is a problem, and how we might come to resolve it. So that's what we're at here, basically. And so my own opinion on that is, as the New York Trader is a definite rewrite, but does contain quite a lot of the original Captain Glenn, I would tend, because they don't join together in any way later on, like some ballads do. They are two separate things, and in that sense, I would recommend that they would have two separate round numbers. But again, that is something that's up for discussion, and we need to sort out, perhaps. The next one, moving on from that, is L13. We have the Whiskey in the Jar and the Irish Robber. I'm sure you're all familiar, at least, with Whiskey in the Jar. The Irish Robber contains pretty much the same text, the same ideas, the same story. The whole song itself, from probably the 18th century, has very wide-ranging versions. But I would say there is no clear divide between the Irish Robber, which is L13B, and Whiskey in the Jar, L13A, and I would be quite happy, because there's no sort of, that looks like a definite rewrite, as in the previous case. I would say those two would be far better kept together. So that's L13. Moving on to M31, which is a very easy one from my point of view, maybe not from others. We'll see. We can perhaps discuss this and give our recommendations to Steve on this. But we've got William and Dinah, which people might not be so familiar with, but everybody, I'm sure, here would be familiar with Villikins and his Dinah. Now, to me, Villikins is unquestionably a burlesque, what we call a burlesque. We know who wrote it. We also, funnily enough, because of the person who wrote it, we also know who wrote William and Dinah. They are two easily separable entities, even though they tell exactly the same story, using more or less the same words, except you've got this costermonger sort of language for Villikins. I would say they are so easy to separate, and that they would be separable. They have different a different audience, almost, shall we say. William and Dinah was written by a chap from, I think, Leicester or somewhere in the Midlands, and he brought it to London, and he came, obviously got printed on lots of broadsides. And then Henry Mayhew of the London Labour and London Poor, and various books about London life during the middle of the 19th century, took it in about 1830 something, 1834, rewrote William and Dinah in costermonger language and as a burlesque, a joke, and that became far more famous. And I say the two things are easily separable, so I would tend there to separate them, simply because they are so easily separable. And then moving on from that, we go to P1A, which is two songs going under the title of The Girl I Left Behind. Again, one of the problems here, of course, is that The Girl I Left Behind Me, Girl I Left Behind, is the title for at least a dozen songs, broadside ballads, oral tradition songs. It's used for so many. But The Girl I Left Behind, P1A, is only found in America. But they do have so much in common that, again, there I would tend to keep those two together as one song. Moving on quickly to The Sailor's Tragedy and Handsome Harry, which is P34A. The Sailor's Tragedy. I think, if I remember rightly, The Sailor's Tragedy was printed on a lorry and a broadside. That it was a theatrical piece, but it got onto ordinary broadsides and was widespread and collected in oral tradition. But B, The Handsome Harry, is a total rewrite. It's got its own autonomy. It occurs, it's an American song. It was included in and probably written for the Forget-Me-Not songster, widely printed in America in the 1840s. And there, because again, another difference there that's quite telling is that the Sailor's Tragedy has an AABB rhyming pattern, and Handsome Harry, the American rewrite, has an ABAB rhyming pattern. And therefore, I would strongly recommend that those two are kept separate because they have their own autonomy, even though they're telling the same story and have some text in common. Moving on to the sixth one, P36 is The Cruel Ship's Carpenter, or The Gosport Tragedy, sometimes known as, and B is Pretty Polly. Again, the Pretty Polly is just a shortening, basically, of The Cruel Ship's Carpenter. So it's just really a form of The Cruel Ship's Carpenter. And therefore, I would, again, there strongly recommend that they both keep the same number, which is Route 15, which they've got. However, there was a burlesque written on this one called Molly the Betrayed, and where that does occur, I don't think there are any versions from oral tradition, but where that does crop up, that, in my opinion at least, should be kept as a separate thing, just as Villikins should be kept separate from William and Dinah. Right, that's the law stuff. Can I just add in there, if anybody wants any further information on any of these or any other thing at all that I'm talking about today, if you want to just email me, I'll put out my email address onto the chat room, and we can discuss this by email. It's a lot easier. Right, now to come on to before I come on to the general issues of the sorts of things that are causing the problems, I did say, Steve, are you willing to say something about how this sort of has come about, and the same things we discussed beforehand?
Yes, I'm not sure what you're going to say from now on, but I can explain what might be obvious, might not if you're not an indexer, as to why these things happen. Is the indexer's dilemma is that you need the information before you can make the decisions, and you can't get the information until somebody has done an index so that you find the information. So you go around in circles. So what has happened, clearly, I mean, fairly obvious with some of the ones you're talking about, is that I've followed laws or some other, expert. If the first book that I index says, oh, these two are the same, then they get the same number. And it's not until you've got 10 versions that you can say, oh, hold on a minute, that might not be true. And when you've got 100 versions, you don't have time to stop and look at them all. So this whole thing is always going to be a work in progress. And I do try to stress this, that, when we give things numbers and stuff, we're making decisions with the information we've got at the time. And it needs all of us, people to do studies of particular songs to come up with definite answers. But we never will have definite answers. This is always going to be iffy. Because even in your introduction, you talked about textual comparisons, which is what we normally go on. That's our rule of thumb, textual thing. But you did say at one point that they've got a different audience, so therefore I'm going to look at them slightly differently. In other words, we do factor in other things. The wassail songs is a good example. That right at the beginning, because I didn't know enough about wassail songs, I thought I'm going to lump them all together. And then one day somebody, or somebody's going to sort them out. Because there is an argument that the people who are looking for wassail songs want them all together. They don't want 5, 10, 20 different numbers for wassail songs. They want to be able to put in one particular thing. It's the same with Mayday songs, hay-segging songs, in other words, the customs people. So you've got another way of looking at this is, what does the user want, the user group? What do the people out there want? because sometimes, if you think about it, sometimes you want things to be together, sometimes you want them to be separate. And again, I don't think there's any real answer to all of that. Sorry, we're getting into index nerd zone here. But what I am trying to say is that it's always going to be subjective, and it will always be a work in progress. But when you get onto parodies and burlesque, as you're probably about to do, then I throw up my hands in horror. I mean, there is just no way of sorting those ones out. But is that what you wanted me to say? That kind of thing?
Yeah. You said that it's always an arbitrary thing, but there are some cases where you've got, you know, cast iron cases. There are some.
Yeah, I agree. But even the cast iron cases, they're only cast iron because you've decided on one particular criteria to use. Either the text or the context or whatever.
But sometimes you've got a song here and a song here with two separate numbers, and they're quite rare songs usually, and somebody said, well, that's the same song, and it obviously is, but it's something you hadn't spotted. Simple as that.
Well, yeah, there's the human error as well.
Yeah.
One other thing I would say, that there's a sort of philosophical difference between similarity by origin and similarity by destination. In other words, you and I think most British people, I mean, this is broadly speaking, tend to look at the history of the song, and that colours the way we decide whether it's the same or not.
I agree.
B has come from A, C has come from B, therefore they're connected. But I find a lot of American researchers aren't looking so much at the history, they're looking at what happened to the song later. So Streets of Laredo, about a cowboy, and Young Sailor Cut Down in His Prime. Now I had those as the same song, and that was the one song that people complain about all the time, is that song, Young Sailor. And I get equal number of people saying they should all be the same, the Young Sailor, the Unfortunate Race, and the same number of people say they should be different. And it does tend to be the people who are looking at the history want them the same. The people who look at the fact that they ended up as different songs want them different. So I think that's a good example of there will always be a subjectivity.
Yeah, which is why I know there's nothing we can do about this now. It's all done and dusted. But and your system is what we all use now. But laws in introducing these extra letters A and B, and if you know, we could go back 30, 40, 50 years, we might think of a similar system whereby something like the Sailor Cut Down, the Unfortunate Rake, has the same number, but each ecotype has A, B, C, D, and so on. But we can't do that now, obviously.
No, but remember that Laws was first of all, he was a pioneer. He was one of the first to try and do this, and the one who did.
Well, you're all pioneers.
The one who does it first gets it wrong, of course. But secondly, he was trying to classify rather than index.
Yeah.
Again, I won't go into detail about the differences, but any librarians here should know the difference. There is a different mindset for classification and for indexing. And he was doing one thing and we're trying to do another thing. So that's one of the reasons why they're going to not match up. Anyway.
Can I just interrupt to say that now you've started to have a discussion, there's one person with their hand up. Do you want to take a question at this?
Yeah, why not?
Well, no, can I suggest we continue just a little bit further?
Oh, okay.
Otherwise, we won't get through what Steve needs to say.
Well, there's plenty of time, but okay. Well, yeah, I'll come back. What I've done next is I've listed what I think are the issues that are causing these problems, and the biggest one, I think, from my own point of view anyway, is the hybrids. where you've got songs that have been, somebody has taken 3 elements, 2 elements, whatever, from separate, what are definitely separate songs, or normally thought of as separate songs, and strung them together. And this has happened, although none of these issues are, you know, we're probably talking about maybe 1-2% of the whole corpus of traditional songs, but these things are still causing us problems. And hybrids, if I just mention yeah, I mean, three examples very quickly off the top of my head. We've got the Cecilia Costello's Grey Cock, which I'm sure everybody by now knows is 3 separate songs, all strung together, undoubtedly. There's no question of that. How do we classify it? That's a rhetorical question. The Distressed Maid, which is a well-known broadside ballad, it's often collected in oral tradition, has been reconfigured as a song called The Lily White Hand, particularly amongst travellers, but not just travellers. It has a different ending. It's obviously at some point been rewritten. It may have had other bits added in from other ballads as well. There's some evidence of that. So that is sort of a hybrid. You've got The Brown Girl as a child ballad, which is an 18th century broadside called The Cruel Nymph or The Brown Girl. Very rare. Only a couple of 2 or 3 copies known of it. And then you've got The Sailor from Dover, which is a very well-known 1810s, 1820s broadside ballad. And they've been conflated and in child, and what this has resulted in, so you've got that's a definite hybrid, and what you there's plenty of proof for that. It's unquestionable, and what you've got there is that following on from Child having published this, you've got The Brown Girl doesn't exist in oral tradition, and yet in all of the American anthologies going from let's say from about 1900 up to the Second World War, in practically every American anthology, you've got under the Brown Girl title, you've got hundreds and hundreds of versions of The Sailor from Dover or the Irish Lady or whatever you want to call it. Nothing at all to do with the Child 295A, but you know, it's fooled all that many people, and it's been even Bronson has all of these versions of the common broadside ballad, A Sailor from Dover, as though it was a child ballad, and that sort of thing, and that's a hybrid that has been put into Child. Another section, obviously we've already mentioned, that Bob's mentioned as well, quite important, is a definite rewrite, often with a different ending or new words. For instance, some examples here, we've got Botany Bay, which is a well-known broadside ballad, and we've got the American Boston City, which has even been collected in oral tradition in this country and is quite popular amongst travellers. So you've got an American rewrite of an English ballad there, and another well-known one is Bruton Town, the Murdered Servantman. Bruton Town, well-known ballad, was rewritten at some point in the early 19th century as The Constant Farmer's Son. Now, nobody puts those two together, but that's just an example of a rewrite. So if you don't put those two together and say that they're the same song because we've got different texts, why do we do that with some of the other rewrites? Well, that's just a point of discussion. And I'm sure we can probably come up with quite a few other examples of that as well. Again, already mentioned, we've mentioned the burlesques. I was going to point you to my chapter in the Routledge book that was published fairly recently. When was it published? Anyways, Steve Rowd and Peter Harrop did the Routledge Companion. Unfortunately, it's 200 quid, so I'm not expecting everybody to have a copy. But there is a chapter in there about burlesques, and I'll just mention some of the burlesques that I I wrote about in there. Lord Lovell and George Collins, which I think are burlesques, but they're not burlesques of something, so there's not a problem there. I think they are, the whole lot of them are burlesques. They were written as burlesques in the 18th century, so they're not a problem. So that's Lord Lovell, George Collins, Lady Alice, so we can discount them. Things like Oh My Love's Dead, a 17th century piece, Captain Digby's Farewell, became burlesque as All My Love's Dead. And some of these burlesques actually went back into sort of serious oral tradition and were sung as serious songs. Another example, Villikins we've already mentioned. Billy Taylor, for instance, Bold William Taylor, was burlesqued as early as the late 18th century. I know it was burlesqued again by people like Sam Cowell, but their burlesque version has gone back into serious oral tradition, and people are singing that burlesque version in the folk clubs now. George Barnwell, another one. The Gosport Tragedy, The Cruel Ship's Carpenter, we've already mentioned as in Laws. Barbara Allen, it's quite probable that I think that I've put a case forward that Barbara Allen itself was a Scotch song, that the one that Mrs. Nip is referred to as singing in by Sam Pepys in about the 1680s, having heard Mrs. Nip singing it on stage. I think that was written as a sort of Scotch song. What Scotch songs meant there was songs written in London that were written in a pseudo-Scottish dialect. And Barbara Allen probably came out from that. It was reprinted in Alan Ramsey's Evergreen, or the other Tea Table Miscellany, sorry, and then was accepted as a serious Scottish song. So and then it was also parodied as the in Scarlet Town version. Again in the 17th century in England, they've got late 17th century broadsides of it. And so you get this sort of burlesque relationship with the serious ballad and the burlesque version. So you know the Scottish the accepted Scotch or Scottish version is very distinct from the English version in Reading Town, in Scarlet Town. In Scarlet Town, the use of scarlet for Reading, a pun on the two, you know, is itself indicative of burlesque. The Twa Sisters, if you look at the versions in Child of the Two Sisters, you've got a definite burlesque there. The fun is being taken out of it. If you have a look in the appendix to the Two Sisters, you can see that the funny version that's there. And again, to me, they would be kept as separate things. The Three Ravens and the Two Crows, I think I discussed last time. The Two Crows is an American minstrel song that uses not just the Two Crows, but also uses the Three Ravens. One of the verses has come from Twa Corbies, Walter Scott's rewrite. Loyal Lover, Oh Cruel, again a fairly well-known broadside piece. At least one of those is a burlesque of the other. Lord Bateman, of course, was burlesqued by almost using the same words as the traditional version by people like Dickens and Cruikshank in making that little booklet they made in about 1840, 1850. And Sir Eglamour is another version of sort of linked up with Sir Ilas, the child ballad. So we've got burlesques to look at. My own opinion there would be they're a definite rewrite. They've got a definite using a different set of words in some way, and they should be given different numbers. Another problem that occurs is commonplaces, and I think I might have mentioned this last time when we were looking at the child ballads. There is a song in the journals and in Southern English collections I call Come Mother. There's no real title being given to it. In fact, the title that's been overused with it is Lady Maisry, and it's been given the title Lady Maisry simply because it's a collection of commonplaces about the little choir boy, not choir boy, page boy who runs off and takes the message, and so far he swam and so far he ran, and then he climbs the castle wall, gives the message, and the person receiving the message says, you know, if this is true, I'll make you my heir, and if this is false, I shall hang you from the nearest tree. All that's a series of commonplaces that occur in several ballads, particularly Lady Maisry, but it doesn't, this Come Mother song does not have any of the, if you take that section out of Lady Maisry, that song doesn't have any of the other business of Lady Maisry being courted by an Englishman, and then the Englishman coming and a family are burning her at the stake and all that sort of stuff. None of that is in Come Mother, and it's just a collection of commonplaces. So that is and should be already definitely separate number. But this all still so brings up the idea of commonplaces, and this is where Bob's one of Bob's ideas comes in, the commonplace of who's going to shoe your pretty little foot, all of those collection of 2 or 3 stanzas that it seems to occur pretty regularly in various American ballads. It's fine if you've got some of the rest of the ballad in there, forget which, Fair Annie of Loch Royale, I think, is the main ballad that it comes from. But if you've only got a couple of those stanzas, it's very difficult to, unless you can link up the tune with another tune and you know which one it is, it's very difficult to decide how to classify that. So commonplaces, and if you think as I do, that a lot of the Scottish commonplaces in the Scottish ballads are due to actual, let's say, people, the Scottish collectors and the Scottish antiquarians shifting them about from ballad to ballad, not necessarily as part of oral tradition, although this probably happened in oral tradition as well. And then one last section that I want to mention that is quite different to all the others, and that is the shanties. And shanties, I think, need to be classified in a different way as textually. They are a different thing completely. They need to be classified by chorus, format, and tune in connection with each other. And possibly the standard 2 or 3 verses that you often get at the beginning of a shanty. Many of the shanties, recent research by people like Gibb Shreffler have come up with the fact that many of those English collections of shanties, in particular British collections of shanties, have been rewritten by captains, and they were using the same idea as you know, Cecil Sharp changing the texts of some of the songs for the audience that they were being aimed at. And I think this is the same thing that's happened from about 1890 up to about 1930 with all these shanty collections coming up. A lot of them, like Terry, for instance, were, I think, rewriting the texts of them to make the book sell, for one thing, and also aimed at a particular middle class audience. So they couldn't actually publish some of the real words that were being sung to shanties because they were simply too rude. So they made up their own. I think what Gibb is saying is many of them made up their own texts for middle class consumption, and they were the actual shanties that were sung were mostly, I think this is fairly generally known, were extemporized on the moment anyway, and spare of the moment by the shantyman. That was his forte. He could actually use a couple of well-known verses and then make up the rest as he was going along. And that is the idea, the whole idea of a shanty. And so they very seldom had stable texts, and therefore what I'm saying there is what we need to look at when classifying shanties as folk songs, which of course they are. Then they need to be classified by chorus, format, and tune rather than a set load of text. A good example of that would be those shanty texts that use "Where are you going to, my pretty maid?" If you can imagine a rough-ass shantyman singing those verses, well, I certainly can't. Right, so those are some of the issues that need looking at: hybrids, rewrites, burlesques, commonplaces, and shanties as a separate issue. That's more or less all I've got there. So if that's okay with Steve, we throw that over to general discussion now, if we wish.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, thank you, Steve. I agree with you with shanties. It's obvious that any kind of system like we're using for textual comparison and so on doesn't work with things that are either ad-libbed or sort of modular, like some children's games. They will sort of add in things from all over the place. It doesn't work for blues. And, you know, there's no reason why the same system would work for every type of song. But shanties is the one that causes us the problem. But I mean, there are references, proper references that's, you know, by people who know what they're talking about, who said that often the shanty person started off with the standard, you know, 2 or 3 verses and the chorus, and then extemporized. In other words, you look at the first couple of verses and do the best you can. But you're right, you do have to look at them differently. Steve, do you want to call on people for comment, or shall I do that?
No, you can certainly do that. I don't think Bob wanted to sort of come onto screen, and I don't think Ben did either. So, but they might like to make an odd comment or two, or
they can put their hand up if they would like to. But for the moment, let's get started. Conrad, you've had your hand up for a while. You'd like to unmute yourself first? Conrad, unmute. Unmute. Can you unmute him, Derek?
No, for some reason.
oh, sorry, is here.
Are you there?
Right, Conrad.
Are you there?
Hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, thanks for Steve for all of his work. It's a wonderful project and very worthy of your time and everybody else's. The one thing that's interesting, being an archaeologist to begin with, you probably realize that we spend a lot of time on classification of artifacts, tools, finds, whatnot, forever, classifying forever. There's a lot of literature on this. I suggest one video series taught by a man from India. I didn't get his name, it's very long, but he goes right through this meticulously, the idea of lumping and splitting. He talks about the idea that you can't know function. You can't know what that thing is doing. You can't ask a chair what it's for. You can't ask the people who made the chair. They're not there. The chair is barely there. So you have to start out with an idea that you have to leave functional discussion behind for a while, and then go out and do more empirical work to convert a song into something abstract to us, but necessary to get the right answer to the assumptions that are made. The other problem is that you have to make such an index a means of finding a ship at sea. You need to get coordinates that you can go with what you want, starting always with a question. You always start with a question, and then you have to be able to answer it. You need to know where to find that in the sea of. That's what you need to do. I want to find it. I don't want to go look at too much broad information or too many selections. I want to find the one I want. So you have to characterize these things so that people can come with diverse questions and objective inquiries. You have to be able to find the thing, but the main thing is you have to be able to plan for future use, ideas and analytical techniques that we don't have yet. And for that, I suggest a material description of these things, and something like the diagramming of sentences. If you're familiar with diagramming sentences, it's a tedious process and a terrible thing for students. But declining sentences or structuring them out is very helpful, because you can work in many different variables at the same time, outlining the sentence structure as it goes down. I see the same thing as a possibility for songs and all of that.
Thank you, Conrad.
Multidimensional.
We couldn't catch all of that because you are breaking up. But can I get Steve? Do you want to say something, or shall I go on?
Yeah, definitely. I could follow
I
could follow what most of Conrad was saying there, and I think what he's saying, it has a lot in common with what Bob Walsh is saying. His sort of studies very much use something from biological studies. I think it was something called stematics, which is very close to what we both do when we're studying a ballad. We take all of the versions and study each verse against each verse and the wording of each line almost, and we look at it in much great detail. And I think that's got some relation to what Conrad is saying there. I think Conrad, from what I can grasp there, not being au fait with the science involved in what you're talking about, but it sounds very much to me like what you're saying is similar to what Bob Walsh is saying in his methods as well.
Right. Well, Bob has got his hand up, but
we do have that in common.
John's had his hand up. But can we go on to John, please, Conrad? John Baxter.
I'm happy to let Bob talk first because and come in afterwards.
Bob, are you there? We've just got a picture of your banjo at the moment.
Bob, you need to unmute.
I know, but I had to find the button.
There you are.
I should remember that you can do it with the space bar. Anyway, to explain the bit of the biological analogy is actually Linnaean classification, like genus and species. And there's actually something to be said for that. Because there we have two levels of classification. Taking something like the unfortunate rake, if we could do a system like that, the unfortunate rake and the streets of Laredo and all of those are a genus, but there's species within that genus. And no, I have no idea how to do that either, and I don't do that. But yes, the nice thing about stematics is that you can assemble a family tree, if you can, and sometimes you can't. And the point that I originally wanted to make before all this other stuff came up that got me all excited is that a great deal in all of this depends on what you originally see. And if the first version you find is a good version, you're going to get good classification. And if the first stuff you see is a few little fragments, then it's very hard to build a good classification, and you're probably just going to have to come back and rebuild it later on.
Yes.
Be prepared to do so because you're going to need to. All right, I will pass on.
Can I just point out again, not commenting what Bob just said, there is a difference between indexing and classifying, and what you're talking about is classifying. An index is just a finding aid. It's just to help you find things. Now, there is an element of, you've got to make decisions which are sort of classificatory decisions, but an index is simply that, to help you find things. And you have to decide what people want to find. Do they want these things grouped together, or do they want them separated? Whereas as a classifier, you really have a different head on your shoulders. So both of these concepts are important here, but try and keep them separate in your minds a bit. Anyway, John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'll try and keep them separate in my mind. You can shoot me down in flames if I don't. one thing that occurred to me that when Steve was talking is that a lot of the cases when songs have been lumped together that have subsequently had to be split, it's because of lack of information, as people have said, and part of that is I thought there was another group of songs where you talk about memes or a central theme. So Rock the Cradle, John, you know, being a series of songs about men raising kids that are none of their own. I've recently reread something you wrote about it, Steve, probably quite a long time ago, but because I'm looking at a series of songs, what turns out to be a series of songs and parodies around the theme of wanting to be a baby. You know, I wish I was a baby again, to be bounced on somebody's knee, but they never do it now. They never do it now. I've got itches in my britches, but they never do it now. That song actually turns out to be a whole load of people building songs on the same single comic idea. But we wouldn't have known that if there hadn't have been, you know, the clues are there, and I haven't sorted it out yet, and I'm waiting on various digitized sheet music to come from Oxford before I can finish what I've done. But it turns out that what we thought was one song is probably at least 4 and possibly as many as 6.
Wow.
But the version that went into the folk world is actually almost always based on the Captain with His Whiskers tune, and it's the tune in this case that allows you to say, I think, that gives you a different view, and perhaps that needs to be more important sometimes. Perhaps that can help. But I'm glad I'm not Steve, having to make the decisions.
Thank you, John. Can we go on to Vic? Unmute, Vic. Unmute. That's it.
That's it. Sorry. No, it's been an interesting discussion. I just want to make a few observations, really. I mean, I was quite interested in Steve's distinction between making an index and classifying, but then again, as Steve said, that there is a necessity to classify in the act of making an index. Now, to me, with a sort of interest in anthropology, I mean, there's a sense in which all classification is sort of arbitrary. You decide a set of criteria whereby you do things, and we need classification to cope with a complicated world that we can't. Is just chaos unless we do. I remember Steve sending me an email once and said something like, I may be misquoting here, a happy life is based on good indexes or something like that, which I think was wonderful. I should have kept it and framed it. But so we're always going to have this dilemma, this dilemma. And when you go to another culture, why it's another culture is that people classify things differently. They don't always believe the same things. What I think we perhaps lose sight of, and I'm really in favour. I mean, the Raud Index is a wonderful thing in terms of finding stuff, and that's, as Steve said, its main thing. When Steve Gardham says that the Mrs. Costello's Grey Cock is actually 3 different songs. Well, it isn't when Mrs. Costello sings it. It has attained a unity and a coherence and an immanence, which is what it is. Now, its origins may well be 3 songs. I sing a version of My True Lover's The Americans Have Stole My True Love Away, which is a bit of that song. It's a bit of Meeting is a Pleasure, and it's got a bit of the cuckoo stuck on the end. But the coherence is in performance. This doesn't help us with classification at all. It's a real problem. So that's a point. And I think if we get too much of the classification head on, we lose that immanence, that importance of the thing in itself in the moment. And the last thing I would say, Steve Gardham says the brown gold doesn't exist in oral tradition. Did Baring Gould invent those versions? I know Baring Gould is iffy. I'm sorry that Martin's not here, but he actually invented. There's at least 2 different versions in Baring Gould, and the fact we hasn't been collected much doesn't mean that it didn't ever exist in tradition. That's to do with collection, not to do with anything about whether the thing had oral legs. One interesting one, which my study of Barbara Allen has stuck on this. What's the relationship between Barbara Allen and the Brown Girl? That is really interesting. Are they the same song? No, they're not. But they're actually got very strong parallels in them. And I don't think you can ever take things much further than having a sort of really good guide, which is, I think, what the Round Index is. I will shut up.
Can I just make one point before we go to Bob? When you're talking about things like Mrs. Costello's song, and we said, Steve is probably right that it's 3 songs stitched together, but did Mrs. Costello stitch together 3 songs, or did somebody previously do that and Mrs. Costello has learnt it, and as you say, Vic, it is now a song in its own right? And that's our problem. We don't know how these things have happened.
We'll never know.
No,
In most cases we won't know. We do know about Tom Sherman's Barroom and the Streets of Laredo and so on. We don't know in most cases. I mean, it's Hugh Shields stuff on the Mrs. Costello, and he's really dismissive of it. I think it's a wonderful song. I think it's wonderful in the way she performs it. It works. Now, lots of things are hybrids and amalgamations. That's life. That's what we do. We take bits from here, bits from there, put them together. It's the immanence, it's the presence that seems to me so much important. And I think we can lose sight of it when we get a historicist sort of perspective on things.
Yeah. Well, in that case, what's wrong with that particular song having its own number completely?
Well, then you're going to lose all the point of having a finding aid, because it is clearly related to lots of other Night Visit songs. It's got some of the same verses. It's related to Willio, but Willio goes off in its own direction. I think you've got to keep it fairly crude and fairly simple. That's why I don't like this idea of subdivision. I would say that the unfortunate. I've never seen a traditional song called "The Unfortunate Rake," by the way. I've seen "The Unfortunate Lad." But the Unfortunate Lad, the Young Trooper Cut Down, the Streets of Laredo, Tom Sherman's Barroom, to me, belong to a family. The problem is always in classification. This comes up in tune classification, in that where do you draw the boundaries? There is no easy way to do that. I mean, Bayard comes out with this whole sort of theory of tune families. It's really interesting, and clearly tunes do exist in families. But what's the difference between that where's the line you can draw? And that happens in song versions as well. Any line you draw will be arbitrary. And so the best thing is to have a finding aid that finds everything and most things, and stuff you don't want as well. And at least you're getting somewhere with it. If you subdivide it too much, you're gonna have the morass that life is, not one thing.
We've got that already. It's called Google.
Yes.
Very good. Before we answer what Vic's been saying, Bob's had his hand up for a while. Bob Walsh again.
Well, maybe you should deal with that anyway, but I have, okay, I've got something for you. I'll give you one thing and then you can answer that question and then come back to me. But I've got a little challenge for you folks. And this is Meredith and Anderson's Folk Songs of Australia. And unfortunately, it's a combination of 2 American songs, but maybe some of you will be able to catch it anyway. This is the chorus. Hurrah, hurrah, we'll bring the Jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah for the flag that sets us free. And now we'll sing the chorus from the land unto the sea, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Now, is that the battle cry of freedom? Is that marching through Georgia?
Marching through Sydney. I don't know. What's the rest of the song? Or is that all you
The
we've
rest of
got?
the song is equally mixed up. For example, the next verse is every verse mixes lines from both songs, and I don't know the melody, so I can't go by that. It is basically 50% one song, 50% the other, and it's not just that they're one verse from here, one verse from there. They're lines from each song in each verse.
That's a chimera.
It is a chimera. It's a multiple chimera. So that's just an example of how really tricky this can get. And then I will let you go back to what you were saying, and then I'll come back to what I was saying, because I have thoughts about the difference between a finding aid and a classification aid.
Well,
So
I think what you've just brought up, Bob, is something that I was going to say, following on from what Vic was saying, and we were all saying about Mrs. Costello's lover's ghost or whatever. We get mixed up all the time between talking about one version of a song, one performance, if you like, of a song, and the song as a global entity. Now, we can give a number or a description or some other code to the global entity, all the versions of Barbara Allen, but an individual performance where somebody starts off as singing Barbara Allen and ends up singing something else, we can give that performance two numbers. We can say, if you're interested in Barbara Allen, you will want this song. But if you're interested in The Lover's Ghost, which is also in this particular performance, we can give that number as well. In other words, the indexing, the finding aid, wants me, the rest of us indexers, to indicate that that particular version, that particular performance, is, in our opinion, interesting for the people who want those both songs. We're not necessarily saying it is those two songs, but the people interested in those songs want to find it. That's one of the things I'm trying to get at.
Can I come back in there, Steve?
Yeah.
I was quite interested recently. I was using your index. I don't use the new version. I'm still using the old one because I can't get me. I haven't seen your thing about your index, the Zoom thing that you did recently. I haven't seen that yet, and I strongly suspect that I don't want to see it as well. But yeah, I came across in the old index, I can't remember which song it was, but it had two numbers with it. And it's the first time I've ever seen that. 533, something like that it was. 533, 534, something like that. It had two numbers anyway, which I was quite pleased about. So what you're saying just then is that if you wanted to, the grey cock, Mrs. Costello's The Grey Cock, you could put three numbers on that. Is that right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is that the version, the performance, that instance of the song deserves three numbers, because we can't classify it by one number.
Problem solved.
If you classify by one or index by one number, you by definition exclude other numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there's a history to this. When I first started the index with the early databases, it was very difficult to put more than one number into the number field. It buggered the whole thing up. So what I used to do is, if a song was definitely two songs, I would enter it twice, one with each number, and there'll be a cross-reference in there saying, this seems to be two songs, so I've entered it twice. That's all I could do. Now I'm moving towards actually putting in both numbers in that one field. So again, I get back to this finding aid. What do people want to find if they're interested in this particular song? So yes, that's what I'm starting to do now. But I mean, things still have to have the number for me to be able to put it in. And if you take it to the logical extension, every song is going to have 14 numbers in there because there's some connection. there has to be a sort of limit to it. Now, Bob's got his hand up again.
I would just say here that we actually have two indices floating around here, and in this sense they complement. The route index is a finding index, and it basically does everything by the instance. That is, every song is filed as an instance. Maybe in some cases it's filed as 2 instances, which is great, actually, because I agree with that, because that's what I do. If I find something like that song that I gave that is at Battle Cry of Freedom and Marching Through Georgia, it's filed with both songs. But this is where the way that the traditional ballad index does things, it is more of a classification aid, because it is files things by the song. So all the Barbara Allens are in the same record. Whereas in the route index, they are all individual records. And this is why I am very glad that Steve was willing to cooperate on this, because we have 2 different indices done in 2 different ways, and you can start whichever one you want to. Probably more often than not, his index is the best way to start as the finding aid, because he quotes all the first lines and I don't quote all the first lines. So his is the way to start. Then if you want some more information about classification, you can go to mine, and that will give you more of the examples of where there is a thing with all these floating verses in it. It'll say, here's the Battle Cry of Freedom with floating lyrics from Marching Through Georgia in there. So it's use the classification system you want. We've got them both, and we both have problems sometimes. But often you can use both to complement each other to sort of try to help those problems. I think Steve may disagree.
No, there's too many Steves on this call. There's at least 3 of us. I agree, and I would bring in other specialist indexes like John Baxter's musical index, because one of our problems is in folk song, traditional song, is that we're dealing with all kinds of songs. We are dealing with shanties, we are dealing with children's ditties, we are dealing with big ballads and bits of songs and stuff. We need the specialist eye, as John gives us, on one particular area, you know, the music hall song, the comic songs and so on. You need to know about hymns, you know, so you go to hymnary.org or whatever their name is. In other words, all of these things, approaches, have to work together. However, they only work together if we agree on some kind of system, because we know that our titles don't work. You know, titles don't work as a common thing, because they're too fluid, and that's where we get back to numbers. Even though I don't really like numbers, you have to have something that is common to Bob's index, my index, John's music hall site, hymnary, and so on. And that's the tricky part, is getting them to mesh together. But Ben's got his hand up. Ben? Hi, Ben.
Got it. I have a question for Steve Gardham. Steve, when you set out to investigate a set of songs, do you have a procedure in mind? Do you have an attack, a way that you go about doing the investigation? Because I have mine, which is off the wall. So but I'm interested in what yours is.
Yeah, no problem there. Basically, I've got my own library, my own indexes, which are independent to Steve's. I have several different indexes. I have an index that is all of the accepted oral tradition English stuff. And then I have a larger index. These are all on 5x3 record cards still. Steve Rowds was originally on 5x3 record cards. He decided to go technology wise. I stuck with the record cards, and I can simply go bang and I can pick that record card out now for a particular song. It's right in front of me. It's just a matter of time for me. And what I do is it's mainly with the English stuff, I must admit. And I will go to my index. I'll pull out everything that's in my record card on a particular song. I will get copies. I will download copies from the internet. I'll take copies from my vast broadside collection, and I'll take all the copies from all the American books I've got and all the English books I've got. It might not include absolutely every version, but it's pretty comprehensive. And I'll take all those versions, cut them up, put them together, put them out in front of me, give each stanza a letter where it's a fairly regular, I'll usually start with the earliest broadside, let's put it like that. And then I will give all of the stanzas in that a letter. And then I will transfer that to all the other versions, later broadsides and oral versions. And then I will compare stanza by stanza. And then I will come up with a sort of a history and a background and what other likely things are thrown up by that. Basically, that's what happens. And then I use that in the books that I have published. I write the histories to the songs in the various series of books that we've published in the Marrowbone series, for instance. And I use all of that information to write a sort of a history of that particular song. That's how mine more or less works. Does that fit in with yours, Ben?
Well, yours is much more rational. I fight mine all the time. I'll tell you what I do. I take every copy I can find. For example, in this thing we were talking about last week between us, I took all the texts of N36, all the texts of N37, all the texts of N42, all the texts of M8, stuff like so. And I wind up with not too many because I don't have many books left. So I have, in this case, 179 texts. I looked at them line by line, and it's line by line is where we are. Each line is effectively a gene, because what I'm going to do is throw this a phylogenetics piece of software that scatters stuff into what appear to be different songs. And so surprisingly, all the N36 stuff comes out pretty much together. All the N37 stuff comes out pretty much together. The lady in a father's garden splits. But what I'm saying is that's the starting point. And then I'll have to look at things. But here's the problem. We're talking about, are these songs identical or are these songs the same? I tell you that I have serious problems trying to figure out if the lines are the same. And if the lines are the same, I have a serious problem whether they mean the same thing. Give you an example. Part of N36, although generally the songs that we sing for N36, like Pete Seeger's John Riley, which was on his first solo album, about the quarter coming to suit a lady and asking her, will she go with him to Pennsylvania? Going to Pennsylvania is a serious thing. But a standard verse in all of those is youth and folly. Youth and folly makes someone marry. Now, in the 40 or so versions of N36 I have, probably 20 of them have a youth and folly verse. But a different person is asking about the effect of youth and folly in each of those versions. And the line itself has a different meaning depending on who is singing that line. And so the problem is that even when I'm looking at things down to the line, that much detail, I have terrible conflicts in deciding whether they are the same thing. And all I'm saying is, boy, it is really rough classifying and indexing. We are doing such subjective stuff that you and I may come out with the same general conclusion, but how we got there, the assumptions we make, the conclusions we draw that get there are entirely different. And it makes it a lot of fun, but it is crazy. That's all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Bob Walsh has got his hand up again. We're running out of time. We've only got 10 minutes, so keep it short, everybody.
And maybe I should just pass this on. This actually is an area which has been studied in a great deal of detail. It's called textual criticism, and it is something that Child was an expert textual critic. As a matter of fact, he revolutionized the study of Chaucer with his textual criticism skills. It is a related field. There are books on it. If people want, if people want to contact me, we should do that. It is a field that I've done it on various levels of songs. It works. The first one I did was on Zeb Turney's Girl, the Laws ballad that was written by Carson Robeson and recorded by Vernon Dahlhart, and it worked perfectly. It demonstrated, for what it's worth, I was able to demonstrate that yes, Carson Robeson wrote the song because his was the original. You could determine his original from the field recordings. Boney on the Isle of St. Helena, it kind of worked. It didn't work very well. If you get to Mary Hamilton, which I think is probably multiple songs, it works not at all because there's nothing that's common between the versions really. What I did on Mary Hamilton, and I'll give you a link, you can actually see this in the ballad index because I did the work. Go down to the section at the end that says, what is this song really about? Instead of doing it with lines, I did it with motifs. So what's the name of the girl? Is it Mary Hamilton? Is it Mary Mild? Is it Sweet Marie? Is it something like that? And doing very much what Steve started, both what Steve and Ben talked about, you're getting toward what is actually done in textual criticism. So you are reinventing the wheel, but you're reinventing it correctly. That's the good news. And you've got to use what you have and try to classify based on that. And I will stop there because I will get very technical and we don't probably need that. But you can go and look at how I did this with Mary Hamilton, and I put the link in the chat, and I'll shut up.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
One thing I'd like to say is that probably, I mean, how many of us are there? There's 30 of us on the call here. Probably 25 of you don't want to do this. Don't want to get 100 versions of the song and compare them line by line. One or two of us like that sort of thing, and it is our job to do it for you. You know, okay, we volunteered, but it is our job. You know, the nerds amongst us need to do this for the common good, because really, when it boils down to it, you want to know how we've ended up, what we've decided. You don't want to know how we've done it, and you certainly don't want to do it yourselves most of the time. But I get back to, I said earlier on about being a librarian, it's the user that matters here. It's what do you want to find, what do you want to know, rather than what do we nerds like doing. So
Can I jump in here, Steve?
yeah, certainly, Steve.
Yeah, when you say it's what people want to know, who are the people? I mean, who is this index for? Is it for everybody, every man, or is it for people researching folk song?
Yes, that's exactly the problem.
Yeah.
And that in itself brings in problem, because you know, my index, when it was 10,000 entries, everybody could handle it and there was no problems. It's only when it got to 100,000 that we started to get problems, and now we're up to 350,000. We've got huge problems, and it gets harder and harder for a beginner to use because we've got more and more information in there. It's one of the dilemmas of our world, is trying to find something that will suit everybody. And I think what we're talking about, because we are all nerds, we are all folky nerds, we want a level of investigation that most people, most normal people don't want. Anyway, John's got his hand up. Sorry, I'm lecturing you all. Steve, John.
Yeah, I am a nerd, but I also think that the written word is the importance of the written word can be overestimated. There are all sorts of songs where you see them in a written form, and I don't believe anybody ever sings them like they're written down. People make them fit their. I mean, this is an obvious thing, I guess, but you know, for music hall songs, the polite versions were always published as sheet music. They were far ruder when they sang them in the halls. So it's not just it's not just shanties that were written down differently to the way they were sung in situ. But I also think people write down songs in ways that are almost unsingable in some of the Victorian sheet music cases, and I don't believe they were ever really sung as they were written down. If you try and sing them, you change them to fit your voice. Maybe that's the modern voice, but I do think, yeah, I do think that's. I worry when we over egg the textual analysis stuff. That what matters is how they are sung, not how they're written down. I hope that makes sense. It's not meant to be disrespectful to anybody that's doing that work. I am as nerdy as the next man, and I do respect the people that do that textual analysis. It is important, but at the same time, it's how they sound when they sung out that matters most to me.
Yeah, find me a way of indexing that, and I'll see what I can. Anybody got a last comment? Anybody want to? Steve, do you want to sum up everything that's been said?
Oh yeah. Thank you. I'm gonna put, if nobody else has got their hand up, I'm gonna push a book. Yeah.
Yep.
Last minute. It'll only take a minute. Yeah. We sometimes on these, we sometimes do a little book review and things. My review is 110 years old, or rather, that's when the book was published. Yeah. I'm reviewing it because I've only just come across it, and it's very cheap, and it's one of these print on demand type things, and it's Louise Pound. The Americans amongst you will know who Louise Pound was. She was one of Professor Child's students, along with Gomer and Kittredge and all that. And Gomer and Kittredge, Kittredge you can excuse a little bit because his main forte was just cataloguing everything that Child left behind in a mess. But Gomer was this idiot professor who propounded this thing that we no longer look at, this communal composition thing, and the fact that the folk songs are supposed to come from, ballads are supposed to come from dancing and that sort of thing, and put forward these ridiculous theories. And Louise Pound, another of Child's students, in 1920, well, early 1900s, completely blew all of that rubbish out of the water. And she wrote a book. Well, actually, it's a collection of essays that were published in the Journal of Philology and things like that. And the book is called Poetic Origins and the Ballad. There it is, Poetic Origins and the Ballad. An absolutely fantastic book that absolutely rocks people like Kittredge and Gomer and some of the others who were following them at the time, who thought they were fantastic. All the American professors seem to be following their ridiculous assertions, and she shoots them completely out of the water in 1921 with Poetic Origins and the Ballad, and you can get it from Forgotten Books, it says here, but probably other print on demand, and it's a fantastic book. That's all.
I agree. That's worth reading. There's a biography of her as well. I can't remember the author, but it's on the shelf over there. Anyway.
Oh, right. Let us know that, Steve, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for joining in. I hope you enjoyed it. You know, people like me, we have to be allowed to talk about indexes every now and again, you know, because we don't get out much. So it's nice to be able to share our passions with everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, learned something, and we're going to see you again on June the whatever it was I said.
16th.
16th, thank you. And have a good evening or afternoon or whatever your time is. Bye, everybody.